Ariel, I told Howard you're going to be helping us stay on.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Juan Amador, and I'm the Director in Diversity Policy and Programs and the Program Leader for the Group on Diversity and Inclusion here at the AAMC. The Group on Diversity and Inclusion is delighted to be part of the Faculty Lifecycle webinar series to address issues and solve real problems for the academic medical faculty. The Faculty Lifecycle webinar series is a 5-part series featuring a lifetime haul on topics through the continuum of faculty life, from residents through senior faculty. Each webinar is hosted by a different unit within the AAMC, and it's truly a collaborative project. Our facilitated discussions today is the 4th in this series, and is focused on the important issues of race in the workplace. These can be difficult conversations. We need to create safe spaces at our institutions and train leaders to hold difficult conversations that lead to mutual understanding, non-judgment, and a genuine desire to build stronger relationships. For the next hour, you will hear 2 experts in the field, Howard Ross, founding partner of Cook Ross and the author of Reinventing Diversity, and Allison Manswell, author of Lean In, Crucial Conversations on Race in the Workplace. We hope that you will join this important discussion by posing a question or a comment in the chat box. Again, thank you for your active participation. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Howard Ross.
Great. Thanks so much, Juan, and so glad to be with you. And thank you to all of you who have phoned in or checked in to be with us on this important topic. This is a topic that, of course, we're dealing with on a daily basis in our society today, and Allison and I are really happy to be able to share some of our thoughts with you and some of our experience in how to deal with this issue. Before we get into the content, let's just very quickly tell you a little bit about Cook Ross. We were founded in 1989, so we're in our 27th year. We're a certified women-owned organization. We're based in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And the work we do is really broadly in organizational culture development and transformation, leadership, diversity, and inclusion. Many of you probably know that we've had a 4 to 5 year now partnership with AAMC, especially around our work on unconscious bias and helping people in medical schools all around the country look at how unconscious bias plays a significant role in the medical continuum, and particularly the impact it has on things like health disparities. So we just were at Harvard University Medical School a few weeks ago doing a week-long program there with people from schools all over the country. We have 30 full-time staff, plus about 25 additional associates all around the world, and have worked probably in 48 of the 50 United States, and I think at this point over 40 other countries. So we're glad to be with you. Say hello.
Yes, hello, and I'm very excited to be doing this with Howard Ross, and we've had a relationship for many years. I've always been a fan of his work and really respect what Cook Ross does, and I'm very excited to be part of the Cook Ross team.
That's great. Good. So we're going to jump right in then, and we're going to start with this question. You know, what's going on around us right now? Why is it that this is such an important issue for our time? So let's start with a little polling question, and you're going to see on the right-hand side a place where you can actually vote on these. Do you believe that race is a factor in today's workplace decisions? Either a significant factor, often a factor, sometimes a factor, rarely a factor, or never a factor at all? So let's start by voting. Just you can see on the right-hand side, all you need to do is click in the box, and then down in the lower right-hand side, there's a place where you hit the Submit button. And so Felicia, can you put the results up for us now, please? Okay, so we can see that of the 61 people who have voted, 38 thought that it was either significant or often a factor, 10 believe it's sometimes a factor, and nobody believes that it's not a factor at all. And that's, of course, not surprising given the people who we would expect to call into something like this. But nonetheless, I think it's realistic that we know that that we are far from being in a post-racial society right now. We see this happening all the time. So what we want to look at is, what's going on behind the scenes? How does this show up in the various aspects of our world? And we could just take a quick snapshot about some of the kinds of things that have been going on just over the course of the last, I'd say, year or two, so that we can get a sense of what's going on. So we know that there are things like statements like this made about gender. This is actually by an elected official. The anti-immigrant sentimentality that's come up, particularly in the presidential campaign, focused on Mexicans, on Mexican Americans. The resistance to marriage equality that we see, political leaders making fun of people who have disabilities, Islamophobia showing up as students being murdered in 2 places, both in North Carolina and in Indiana. In addition to that, we know that there's an international boycott of halal products as they're produced by various countries. We know the story, sadly, of the 14-year-old who was arrested for making a clock. There's anti-immigrant movements all over Europe now. In India, there's a virulent right-wing Hindu movement that's now attacking Muslims there as well, and all of these are a function of fear. And that's really the challenge that we have right now, is that we're living in a society that's filled with this constant, what we might call almost a sustained post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it shows up in many, many different ways. So one of the things that we've specialized, of course, is looking at it from the standpoint of how does it show up as bias. And this is an important consideration as we talk about these issues, because we know that we all have this tendency of bias. We're not going to get into a whole piece about unconscious bias today, because obviously we want to focus more on how do we talk about these issues. But it is important for us to know that this bias function that we have in our brain is as automatic to us as breathing. It's an automatic response that provides a shortcut for us dealing with things in the world. And it's critical for us to recognize how much that accelerates during times when we have a lot of stress or fear in the environment. And what we do at times like that is we tend to take the personal experience we have of a small number of people and generalize that to a group. So our sensitivity to group orientation, whether that group is defined by racial identity or gender identity or sexual orientation or whatever it is heightened at times when we feel nervous, when we feel afraid. We want to have more control over our environment.
This notion in terms of what happens in the workplace is a perfect example, because workplaces are by definition can be very high stress organizations, and we're there for so much of a part of our day. So when you combine what you just mentioned, this fear response with the sustained stress of a workplace, especially in health environments where the stakes are high, we can expect that these situations will increase.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that the point that Allison just made is a really important one, that the healthcare environment is a place where under normal circumstances there's a high level of anxiety. There's the anxiety of the patient worrying about themselves, being in a strange environment at a time when our resources are low, our personal resources are low. There's the guests who come in and family members who come in. There are people's former history of being in hospitals. All that stuff gets triggered, and so it's a place that we're especially ripe for that. And we know from studying the physiology that, these are all fast brain responses. And, we're for the most part, when we're feeling fearful, we go to those quick responses, just like you've noticed at times, I'm sure anybody who's in our listening audience here has noticed at times when you're feeling a little bit nervous and somebody walks in the room and says, boo, you could hit the ceiling, whereas another time you wouldn't react or respond at all. So our system actually gets sensitized because of the various chemicals that get released in the system to help us prepare for fear. Now, we also have the slow brain capacity to watch ourselves, and that's what we're really wanting to be talking about today. What are some of the things that we can do to start to understand how we respond in these circumstances, to understand our tendency to have a challenge dealing with some of these difficult issues, particularly race in our culture, and the block that creates in our ability to actually deal with some of the issues we're dealing with. So it's especially challenging when these things happen without any awareness, intention, or control when we're not even aware that we're doing them. And often, our unconscious biases, of course, conflict with our conscious attitudes, behaviors, and intentions. So we may think we're doing the right thing without even realizing how it's affecting us.
And I think that's particularly true around race, because most people believe themselves, and actually are right, that they are in and of themselves not intentionally racist, not intentionally biased. They are wanting to do the right thing in every situation. It's an important context setting to make that this is what's happening in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think it's so important for us to remember that while we know that there's overt racism out there, that most people don't wake up in the morning and say, what can I do to suppress the people of color in my organization today? How can I manipulate it so that I give poor quality treatment to my patients who are of color? It just doesn't occur that way for most people. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in trying to understand the dynamics here, is that often the people we're talking about are people who not only appear to be to have the best wishes of people in mind and to want to do a good job, but in fact in their own mind actually feel that way. And if you put them on a lie detector test, a lot of times they wouldn't even notice, it wouldn't even show up, and yet nonetheless it plays itself out. So what happens? We have this. We have these biases that come from our background. We're raised in certain circumstances, we're exposed to certain things, we have cultural orientation, we see the various stereotypes that are flashed before us on TV and the media and various other kinds of places. All of these things are happening, and that creates this bias system that we have, this protective mechanism in our mind. And of course, for the most part, these days especially, this is not demonstrated as much as egregious behavior, the kind of behavior that, you know, that we see on television. We know these things happen sometimes, but not nearly as much as the more subtle behaviors, the micro behaviors that we see. And that, of course, those micro behaviors, the subtle question of how closely do I listen to somebody, or who do I go on my pocket machine, my phone or whatever, to talk to while somebody's talking to me. You know, one person comes up to me and they say, that's right, and I give you full attention, and somebody else says, hold on, go ahead, I'm listening while I'm doing this. You know, we live in this multitasking environment, you know, hundreds of different ways. So all of this leads to advantages or disadvantages that certain people have, and that ultimately leads to inequities, exclusion, and that sort of thing. And where healthcare is concerned, of course, this is more than just a touchy-feely thing. This impacts in many, many different ways. People of color receive fewer or less breast cancer screenings, kidney transplants, eye exams, revascularization procedures, vaccinations, cardiac care, cancer pain meds, mental health treatment, all of these. And it leads to significant health disparities in virtually every major disease for people of color. So we know this is a real problem that's contributed to often by factors that we're not even aware we're caught up into, that give us a greater or lesser sense of sensitivity to certain people. Now, there are literally 1,500 studies in the last 10 years alone that we could share with you about how this plays out. But just to give you an example of how irrational it is, this study that we're going to look at briefly comes from Erin Reeves, who's a researcher in Chicago. And what Dr. Reeves did was she distributed to law firm partners a brief that was supposedly written by a guy named Thomas Meyer. Had 22 spelling, grammatical, and technical errors consciously put in it. And alternatively, law firm partners were told that Thomas Meyer was either white or black. When they were told that he was white, on average, the memo was rated 4.1 out of 5, and they found about 10 errors on average. And you can see some of the comments. He has potential, good analytic skills, generally a good writer, but needs to work on such and such. When they were told that Thomas Meyer was black, everything else being word for word the same, he was rated 3.2 out of 5, 40% more errors found. This one needs a lot of work, average at best, and I can't believe he went to NYU. Now, we could go on to share lots of other examples of this. We know that there are studies that show that African-American patients, including children, receive lower pain medication than others. We know that there are times when doctors diagnose people differently and send, for example, in a study that was done at Mass General and Harvard, send more patients to thrombolysis procedures aligned with how the testing shows they feel towards that particular racial group. So if they test more positively to white people, they send more white people to those tests. And I could go on and on. This is happening all around us. So we want to now dig into a little bit, how do we deal with these issues?
Absolutely. So thank you, Howard, because those studies are all really very important in terms of how we how this shows up for us. And let's dig into a little bit more around the workplace, because on the surface what happens is people feel that the best thing to do, or the way I should approach this, is to not talk about race. And this pervasive feeling that maybe we are in this post-racial age, and maybe because of the risks, legal risks especially, as well as people have a personal feeling that if they talk about race that there might be a negative response from the person that they're speaking to. And we go back to the fear response that you talked about. And Michael Norton's work, actually, I love this quote because he did research that shows that there is actually a negative impact for not discussing race, and there's more harm done, if you will, for interactions where we don't acknowledge that race is in fact an issue, and that we even see and can perceive people to be other races. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about this specifically.
Before we leave that aside, I think one of the things you're mentioning is so important that you know, sometimes people are afraid to talk about race because they're afraid they're going to say the same thing. Sometimes we don't talk about it because we think it's not polite or proper to talk about it. You know, this isn't a topic we go to. And sometimes it's even an undiscussable. We don't talk about it. We don't even talk about that. We don't talk about it. You know?
Exactly.
So it could go multiple levels to this plays itself out.
You're right. You're right. So I don't think anybody was really surprised by some of the studies, and I really think that the reality of what we're talking about, and certainly the number of people we have on the line, is really a testament to say that we are ready to start changing how we interact with race in the workplace. And for the most part, I think that people aren't comfortable. So let's do another poll. Look at the questions that are coming up on your screen on the right, and let's just check in with how comfortable are you with talking about race? A, very comfortable. B, moderately comfortable. C, depends on the person. Or D, very uncomfortable.
And by the way, we won't see your individual answers. This is totally anonymous.
Oh. All right.
So we'll wait for Felicia to put the results up.
Yes. For the most part, people's comfort level tends to have a lot to do with trust. So this is exciting. So this is good. This is a little different than I would have expected. So it seems like we have a tie between people who are moderately comfortable and people who feel that their comfort level depends on who they're talking to. We do have a good number of people who feel very comfortable, which is good. That's actually good to know. And to be honest, this notion of feeling comfortable or your comfort level varying depending on who you're talking to, the underlying issue there is trust. I would imagine that the more trust you have in a relationship is therefore the more comfortable one would feel having this conversation. And this notion of increasing our trust level between people of different races interacting is the very intention for this webinar. It's the very intention of this movement towards having these courageous conversations and the tools that we're going to explore.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's sometimes confusing for people around this level of trust is that what feels appropriate with one person may be even offensive to another. So let's say you take, you know, a relationship like ours. We've known each other for many, many years. We're very comfortable with each other, and there are things we might say to each other, even jokes that we might tell, that if somebody else heard them, who is outside of the context of our relationship, might say, what did he say? What did she say? You know, but for us in our relationship, it's completely comfortable. So I think that this is one of the things that can be really challenging at times.
It can. That often comes up a lot when people think about how African Americans interact with each other and some of the things that African Americans do amongst themselves, and people wonder, well, can I do that? It really has to do with context. The nature of the relationship dictates how that relationship is governed.
Absolutely.
So this whole notion, why should we even talk about race in the workplace? What are the actual benefits? And the first one really has to do with the impact that talent management has on the outcomes that we have in business. And this impact is very clearly documented. We shared one of those slides, the Thomas Myers slide. I think it's a very accurate and it's a very impactful way to show that on day-to-day workplace decisions, we are making what we think are objective decisions, but they are influenced by race. So this notion of talent management decisions, when you think about hiring decisions, promotion and succession planning decisions, on the surface, they appear to be business decisions, but in fact, they are impacting people's lives and livelihoods. So therefore, the amount of money that a family has access to is directly related to this impact on talent management that we're talking about. Now, what's interesting about that is that when you take that forward a few steps, and whether or not someone gets a job, and whether or not someone gets a promotion and has access to more income, impacts where they live. Where they live impacts where their children go to school, and that then starts a whole other generation of problems or challenges that we're seeing in our society. So this is an important issue to solve for.
And I think that the other thing that's interesting is how the intersectionality of various things come together. So, for example, you and I working in a business environment, if we're dressed as business people and the like, we go into an emergency room, people might react to us in a particular way. But if both of us were on the weekend working in the yard in our scrubs, you know, dirty T-shirt and dirty jeans, and we get taken into the emergency room, then the difference in the way you're treated as a black woman might be significantly different than I'm treated as a white man. And it's the combination of those two things, seeing somebody as a perceived low-income or working-class person versus seeing somebody in a business environment along with race comes together. And I think that's one of the things that makes us so complex.
Exactly. Another good reason has to do with the studies that we talked about earlier, and that when we ignore race in a business environment, that these issues around interaction and productivity are actually impacted. So therefore, two people who don't have that level of trust, two people who avoid any mention of race, or even mention of race in the context of current events. So imagine what it feels like for someone to, African-American person, to be sitting in a workplace where something like a Trayvon Martin case has happened, a Freddie Gray case has happened, the South Carolina shooting has happened, and they're sitting in the workplace either listening to other people talk about it or even having their own feelings of fear and anxiety themselves. This is all happening in the workplace, but this inability to talk about it means that they don't have that opportunity to dismiss. They don't have that opportunity to interact or feel heard.
And this can be sort of a grinding effect almost. So you wake up in the morning and, you know, let's say you have sons, and, you know, your son tells you about, or you wake up first to the sound of a story on NPR about another teenager interacting with the police, another African-American teenager interacting with the police, and then you come out and, you know, you're reminded of something that you saw yesterday, and then your son, one of your sons tells you, hey, you know, this thing happened to me yesterday, somebody said something to me yesterday, and then you get in your car and you're driving to work and you notice there's a white guy in the car next to you, and when you look at him, he turns away very quickly, and then you come into the office and I say, good morning, Allison, and there's an edge to your voice when you respond to me, because the grinding effect leads up to, it becomes part of our relationship, and if we don't acknowledge it, that's a problem. So.
Exactly. One of the other reasons for doing this is this notion of the value that dialogue brings, and the notion that two people having sincere conversation between each other actually increases their level of engagement, their ability to collaborate, and from that collaboration comes creativity. Creativity that ultimately leads to innovation. So I often say the two employees who are sitting in any workplace today who are not able to communicate effectively, who maybe have this edge you mentioned between them, those two employees are least likely to create the next iPad for the world. Those two employees are least likely to come up with the next innovation that could move that particular company forward. And the way that I often have people to explain it is, or to understand this, is that we all bring our whole selves to work. We don't leave portions of ourselves at home. The question becomes how much of ourselves can we actualize at work? And at the depths of our souls are who we are. So when we can't access that place where ideas live, we are actually not giving our very best. And so there's a very enlightened reason for addressing race in the workplace, but there are also some very bottom line business reasons for helping everyone to feel actualized and feel heard in the workplace.
And the brain research supports everything you're saying, that what we see is that when people are in a fear state, when they're in a tense state, that the creative parts of the brain shut down and we turn more towards things we're familiar with, more towards things that we know that we can control. When we feel safer and more trusting in an environment, that part of the brain opens up, and we can actually have more access to the kind of connections that bring innovation. So there's some foundational scientific research behind this as well.
Absolutely. So let's take an example. Let's take an African-American female and a white male who meet each other, and at first glance,
so let's say I'm noticing, I've got this thought in my mind, oh great, another African-American woman on my team. Now, what do I call her? Do I call her African-American? Do I call her black? Do I call her a person of color? If I give her feedback, will she think I'm a racist? And by the way, I wonder how long it took for her to do those braids or whatever kinds of things. You know, these are the kinds of things that might be going through my mind. And this has nothing to do with any intention to harm anybody. It may just be simply my feeling of discomfort to know how to address these kinds of issues.
Exactly. Now, meanwhile, I'm meeting the same white male. I'm thinking, okay, great, another white male boss. What is his experience going to tell him about me? And I might be wondering, is he going to give me honest feedback? Am I going to get the little tiptoe, you know, non-specific feedback? I'm wondering if he's making some kind of judgments about my hair. If I show any kind of emotion, will I be perceived as the angry black woman? And so all of this chatter is going on in my head while you're having all of your chatter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, underneath these more conscious thoughts, of course, there's a whole range of subconscious things we're dealing with at the same time. So for me, for example, it might be something like, you know, I've been told all my life I'm supposed to be strong and in control, and, you know, am I being too strong? Am I not being strong enough? Am I being likable enough? I may, you know, really like for people to interact with me positively, so I want you to like me. I may be worried that, you know, that you not think that I'm a racist. And so I may even go out of my way, and we see people who sometimes do silly things as a result of that, like, yo, Allison, what's up? Did you see Aretha on TV the other night? And you're sitting there, it's like, when does he talk to anybody that way, you know? But that's
Don't
sort
do
of
that
awkward.
Anymore,
right. So that's part of what goes on.
Right. And then while you're having all that chatter, I might be thinking to myself, okay, so am I coming across as smart enough? Am I strong enough? Or am I too strong? Did that come across badly? Did I, was expressing emotion, too much expression? Am I coming across as angry? To the point that a lot of times, this is an interesting piece of feedback, Black women get feedback that they don't express any emotion, and that could sometimes be from being so self-conscious of expressing emotion that they become so reserved that they become void, which is an issue in and of itself.
And I think one of the things that happens any time that we have somebody who's in a non-dominant group, whether it's by race or gender or anything else, there's also the concern about acting in a way that's more in concert with the mainstream way of acting. Now, I say that with air quotes, but the mainstream cultural phenomenon in our organization, which generally is built more around people who look like me than people who look around you.
Absolutely.
And so there's an extra tax, we might say, for you to change yourself, to manage and monitor yourself in that way. And obviously we're not talking just about individuals here, we're talking more archetypically about groups of people. So for example, African American women may need to be more careful about that than white men might need to be. And now, but the person I'm getting to know now is not the real you. It's the person who you're feeling like you need to pretend to be.
Yeah.
And to some degree, we all do that, but nonetheless, they are for all of us. It might be interesting for you, as you're listening, to just take out a piece of paper and make a note for yourself. What are some of your underlying fears and concerns that you think drive some of your behavior? You know, are there places where you worry about not being seen as the wrong kind of person or feeling the wrong kind of way? Are there places where you're afraid people will get angry with you or you'll come across as too angry, this kind of thing, just as a little self-exercise while we're going through this?
Yeah. So let's talk about what's happening when this chatter is going on. We are attempting to have an interaction, but what we're really doing is igniting each of these triggers. So the chatter in our heads, coming from a place of maybe our own biases, our own experience, we are now put triggers in our behavior. We triggered, we then behave according to our triggers, and now we've created an interaction that's tense in a place where it didn't need to be. And so a lot of times, there's a lot of the fear around addressing race in the workplace comes from people not being clear about these triggers. They're not clear about the triggers they have on their own. They're not clear, or they're speculating the triggers that someone else might have, and they are concerned about what really will happen if I say the wrong thing, as opposed to an approach where we approach each other as individuals just here to learn more about each other, and really putting this notion of race and the questions we have out there as something to explore and learn from and actually build relationship equity in.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's important, I think, for people to recognize is that it's not only in the discussion of racial issues that this dynamic can impact us. For example, let's say I'm trying to explain something to you. In my head, I'm worrying, God, am I doing a good enough job of explaining it? Maybe I'm not doing a good enough job of explaining it. So I say to you, well, did you understand what I meant, Allison? Now, let's say you're stuck in that conversation. Am I being seen as smart enough? When I say, did you understand, Allison, you don't hear it through my concern. You hear it through your concern. Oh, so he thinks just because I'm a black woman, I'm not smart enough to understand. And here we have, and that dynamic can go both ways, of course. And so these underlying conversations are so important for us to have a sort of a window into to know what we're reacting to and why we're reacting the way we're reacting.
And to be honest, that's the part of our work that I love the most, because what we do is we begin with the inner work. We begin with the flashlight, turning the flashlight on ourselves, because we are in this area where we're dealing with these challenges in addressing race, of which we are clearly talking about understanding each other and the nature of the relationship. And in the area of race, for some races in America, there's this varying history with the races that is also coming into play with understanding each other. We're also dealing with understanding the impact on each other. This is an area where I think we could do so much more, and when we talk a little bit more about Listen In and how it came to be, this is an area where we don't understand enough about how this element of race impacts each other. So whether we talk about it or we don't talk about it, the things that we say or don't say are all having an impact from day to day, and we are underestimating the nature and the level of that impact. In addition to those challenges, we also have the challenges around how do we engage in new behaviors. So what exactly am I going to do? That's a good question. Do Black people want to be called African American? Do they want to be called people of color? And guess what? If you ask 4 Black people what they want to be called, you might get 5 different answers because it's all very personal. Sometimes people don't understand that the difference between African American and Black comes from whether or not someone identifies as being from a country other than America, so whether it's from the Caribbean or another nation. Other people might not realize the history behind some of the other words is in and of itself what creates the energy around what we call each other. And so as we embark on how do we engage in new behaviors, what we're going to address in a little while is what should we be doing differently. And the part that's really important here, and this is what I said about our work, the notion of understanding ourselves and taking the time that we don't often take in the workplace to understand what are those triggers that we've grown up with. What is it in our background that causes us to think and believe a certain thing about a particular group? What is it in our personal experience that causes us to behave a certain way? My colleagues now know that I am deathly afraid of dogs. And whenever I'm faced with that fear, one of the first things they ask me is, well, were you bitten by a dog once in your past? Because we are aware that a past event could very well cause behavior to happen in the future. So once we become aware of what are these things for each of us, we're better able to now do the work of how we can talk about race. But it first comes from being aware of these challenges, being aware of the dynamics happening, understanding ourselves, and then now we can move to a place around how do we actually talk about race in the workplace.
Great.
So when we were coming up with a few things that we could share, we thought of what would be the most important, and we always want to start with recognizing our own biases. I understand that as an African-American female, I walk through the world as a mother first, and so on any given day, I could be reading 100 news stories, and the one about police brutality will jump out at me first because my background causes that to come to light for me. I also, because of the work I do, so I work in diversity, I've written a book about race, certainly race is on my mind. I also have to be cognizant that race doesn't become the lens through which I see everything. And so that's an important bias for me that I'm often aware of. In addition, gender. I tend not to see gender as much, so I'm aware that race trumps gender in my head, and so that's just a mindfulness. So I am conscious when there is a gender issue, I often will look at it through a different lens, and it's not as a lens that's as natural for me as maybe race might be.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, too, I think that it's so important for us to recognize that when we're talking about recognizing our own biases, this runs right in the face of some of our more conscious thoughts about ourselves. So if, for example, I notice that despite the fact that I've been working in diversity as a profession for over 30 years and that I've been doing work in social justice for 50 years, that I still have a reaction to somebody, let's say a young African-American man on the street, there's part of me that doesn't want to believe that about myself, because the very structure of my identity is that I want to do the right thing. I want to be a good guy. I want to do the right thing. And yet this thought still comes in. And so this notion of recognizing and confronting our own biases is a deeply confronting personal challenge to some of us. And one of the things that we really want to emphasize about this is that it's really important to try to remove guilt from this equation and replace it with responsibility. Feeling guilty causes us to contract. I often say that, if you think about people who make you feel guilty in your life, do you want to be around them more or less? I mean, usually less. And so guilt causes us to contract. And the challenge we've had with some traditional diversity training is a lot of it has been dealing in the currency of guilt. How guilty can we make people feel so that they change, when in fact sometimes that can get in the way of our own self-exploration.
Absolutely. So the next one, of course, is seeking to understand, and this has to do a lot with empathy, understanding the position of the other person. I would venture to say that any of the races actually are looking to intentionally cause harm to others. For the most part, especially in the workforce, people want to be cordial and they want to be in relationship with other people. And so seeking to understand their point of view is so very important. This notion of gaining new skills and actually increasing your comfort level. This is the part of the work where we have to say this is going to come from awareness first, and then it will come from skills and being able to apply what we've learned. And this notion of taking the time to learn new skills is a place where people can really invest and get a great return for the time spent. This willingness to be vulnerable and to just have those conversations. There are a number of strategies that I've offered as well, and nothing is more powerful than just being willing to be vulnerable, being willing to be wrong. And if you engage in a conversation with someone and you say something that causes them to have this look on their face with the furrowed brow, your first instinct could be, I am so sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, that was not my intention. People appreciate a genuine and sincere expression, that was not my intention. And it opens the way for a dialogue so that you become aware what about that might not have been understood. I often use the joke about African Americans being called articulate, and I would imagine there are still people out there who don't understand why that's not necessarily seen as a compliment. So engage in a conversation and say, I'm so sorry, what about that offended you? And be willing to just be vulnerable.
And even to be willing to acknowledge the discomfort in having these conversations. To be willing to say, look, I really want to have a conversation with you about this topic, and I just want to, just to be transparent, acknowledge that sometimes in the past when I tried to have these conversations with people, it's been difficult, and so I feel a little, I feel a little afraid, frankly, of having this conversation. It's not like there's anything particular I want to say. It's just I don't want to screw it up. And then the other person is likely to say, I feel the same way, and then all of a sudden there's a clearing for us to have a conversation in a way that wasn't there before, and even a check-in. So how are you feeling now, and that sort of thing.
That's a perfect example. Perfect example. I loved what you said earlier about the difference between guilt and responsibility, because there is the need, if we're going to move forward, if we're going to move our nation forward, we are going to have to accept responsibility to be part of a solution to a problem that none of us created. And the analogy I like to use for this is recycling. So single-handedly, I did not destroy the oceans. Single-handedly, I'm not ruining the rainforest. However, I choose to engage in recycling behaviors because I understand that I have a responsibility to be part of the larger solution. And that's the analogy I like to have people look at, is to say, nobody created this issue around race. Nobody single-handedly created the energy and the discomfort or any of the systematic issues that exist, but we all collectively have a responsibility to be part of the solution. So for every conversation we have, for every courageous move forward, it's like recycling one more bottle.
Exactly.
And then finally, one of the things we can do as an organization, and one of the things that we can do to make significant progress, is to promote the benefits. And the more people hear the small wins, the more individuals who had that one conversation are able then to talk to others and say, you know, we had and maybe it's an employee resource group who gets together and they host a conversation about race, and then they invite all races and all elements of diversity, and people are now having a larger conversation. Each one of those people go out and they're having conversations, whether it's in their community, they're having conversations in other departments. We're now expanding the benefits that one conversation gained, and now all of a sudden we've got exponential returns for one conversation. And so in the business world, we're very, very focused on what our return on investments are and what are we going to get back from this and how can we avoid risk. And sometimes the things we cannot quantify actually have this exponential energy that we could never put a dollar value on, and that's the way I'd like people to think about race in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that the other point consistent with this in terms of what you're making is that a lot of times the structures that we have in organizations actually can, despite their best intentions, discourage us from being able to talk to these issues. You know, so for example, if you look at employee resource groups, which are, you know, whether we call them employee resource groups, some people still call them affinity groups, some people now call them business resource groups. You know, I've seen them called many different things. You know, historically and traditionally, we've had these as very homogeneous groups. And so if we have a women's ERG or African-American ERG or a Hispanic ERG or whatever it is, specifically for that group. And one of the things that some of our more progressive clients on this issue have been doing is to have those groups open up to anybody who wants to see a breakthrough in that area. So rather than having, for example, a women's ERG, to have a gender equity ERG, and the men and women who are committed to that issue can come together. And the same thing with race, to have people, you know, of multiple races come together. Now, that doesn't mean you still can't have time for people of the same race to have part of that time by themselves. But one of the really powerful things that can happen relative to dialogue is, let's say if we have a group like that, white folks go into one room and talk for a while, folks of color go into another room, and then come back and share what they came up with and talk together. And then we're really using the structure of those organizations to encourage more dialogue rather than to continue to reinforce the separation.
Absolutely. And that's actually the place where we're offering solutions, not only in terms of workshops and learning modules, but facilitated discussions. Facilitated discussions that lead people to new ideas. I love the format that you just talked about. And specifically, people often ask specifically about Listen In, which is actually how this webinar came to be. The book Listen In was really it's a fascinating story. I remember when Lean In first came out, a colleague was we were talking about it, and you know, there were elements of the book that just didn't resonate with us. And I said, I wonder when someone's going to write a book about being black in the workplace. And she said, when you write it. I was like, oh, no, I won't be doing that. That would be career suicide. And the idea literally just didn't leave me alone. And what was powerful about it is after 20-some-odd years in HR and specializing in talent management and leadership development, I realized that my observations had given me a degree of insight that would be awesome for people to understand what it feels like to experience race in the workplace. So Listen In is really a business fiction novel that surrounds 5 African-American friends who meet for drinks after work. And in one of the early chapters, a white CEO overhears them talking about this experience of race, and he gets curious about what is this experience inside his organization. Ironically, he hires a consultant. They do some deep dive work. They examine metrics that people don't normally look at. They did the work. They did the work that an organization needs to do. And then I won't be a spoiler and save the end of the story for you, but it's really transformational what happens to each of the characters on a personal and professional level, as well as the results that the company is able to glean. And so it was a great way for me to combine not only my personal need to be part of the solution, but a way to combine my expertise and to really give away some of the solutions that we could be using to make progress in this area. So I appreciate the way that the book has been embraced as a tool to facilitate these roundtable discussions. And so that's one of the things that we offer in this space in terms of roundtable discussions, as well as the piece that Leslie and Rosalind did around women and race. And what's important about women and race is that when we talk about a gender group of women, it often has a connotation and often means white women when it comes to results. And women of color are often excluded from this conversation around race. And what we've done is we've created a dialogue that can be used incredibly effectively for women to understand what this dynamic of race feels like, looks like between them, and how we can ultimately move forward. So we're really excited to have that as another part of what we offer at Cook Ross.
Yeah, Allison is, by the way, talking about our colleagues Leslie Trout and Rosalind Taylor O'Neill. Just one thing about that I think is really important. It speaks to at the heart of one of the great challenges that I think that happens between people when we're talking about race, and that is that people in dominant groups tend not to notice our group identity as much. White people tend not to notice race, for example, as much as people of color do. We don't have to, of course, in order to be successful. I'm not saying, by the way, that we shouldn't. I'm just saying that we don't. It's the nature of it. Just in the same way as most of us who are heterosexual, when we think about it, how often do we think every day about the notion of sexual orientation? And yet most people I know who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender say that that's a regular part of their mental dialogue every day at various different times in their lives. So when you talk about white women getting together with women of color, often the conversation can be white women say, well, we think of ourselves as women. And then the women of color say, oh, no, you're white women, because the racial dynamic shows up in imbalance in that conversation. So why don't we just open it up now to some questions?
Absolutely. One other thing we should talk about, at least, is your two books that are still very good resources, excellent resources, actually, in terms of how we understand race in the workplace and the suggestions that are there. Actually, that was part of my introduction to your work, and I remember using them as resources for talent management professionals. So I think that one of the things that Cook Ross offers is this ability to be thought partners with our clients and have resources that help these conversations.
Great. Well, I know we have a couple of questions coming in already, and we can start with those. And if we have any other questions, if you could just go into your chat panel, you can see down at the bottom. Actually, let's leave that screen on so you can see down at the bottom where it says, and you can just send it to everybody, and we'll see those questions as they pop up. And then we've got a couple that have come in already. Okay, good.
So while we're waiting for those other questions, maybe we can touch on one of these.
Okay, good.
So this question was, why do you think it's so hard to have these conversations about race?
Well, I mean, I can certainly jump in speaking from my own experience of, spending now 30 years professionally trying to get people to have these conversations in a constructive way, and of course even more than that personally, and that is that this is an area where we have a tremendous amount of wounding in our culture. And we don't have a lot of examples, frankly, that we're told about in any case. I mean, there is actually a deep and very rich history of people working across race-defined solutions in our country. And for anybody who's interested in exploring that more, there's a wonderful organization based out of Wheelock College called the Race Amity Institute that William Smith is the guy who runs that program, and they've collected, literally thousands and thousands of stories of cross-racial cooperation and the like. But of course, those aren't the stories we mostly hear, and mostly what we hear are negative experiences that come across every day. And so, as a result of that, we're left thinking that this is a danger zone that we could get into. And I think that that's a big piece of it. And then the second piece is the piece that you speak to so beautifully in the book, which is even if we want to have those conversations, it doesn't mean we know how to have those conversations. Yes. And so navigating these dangerous waters without having any rule book, it can be a real problem. I see we have another question. It says, could you please address the lack of Native Americans in the workplace, AMC and maybe your organization, how you address them? Native Americans are rarely, if ever, addressed in any diversity discussion, including your discussion today. Yeah, that's absolutely true, and it is very rare, and I think that it's a challenge actually for indigenous populations in general around the world. Often, in the case of Native American people, because the percentages are so low, that, of course, means that they're less present and fewer issues to deal with. We've actually worked quite a bit with Native American populations in the United States, and of course, where health issues is concerned, this is an issue that's incredibly important because health disparities in the Native communities in this country are among the worst around, not only health issues, but dental issues. For example, a number of years ago, we did a major planning conference with the American Dental Association, helping them design a 5-year strategy for increasing the quality of care to Native peoples on reservations. But you're absolutely right that you know, in a short time we have today, we've mostly talked about white and African American dynamics. But of course, there are multiple dynamics that are different in various different ways, or distinct, maybe a better way of putting it, depending upon the racial interactions, and not just between whites and people of color, but also between different groups of color, even people within, as you and I talked about, even in the Black community, between people who are African American versus people who are Caribbean or African born, in the Latino community, between Cubans and Mexicans versus Puerto Ricans, for example, and white community between people who are Christian, Jewish, or so all of these can be factors as well.
And it is a very good question, because I would hate for anybody to feel left out of the conversation. I know that one of the strategies in writing Listen In, someone asked me why weren't the 5 friends different races, and I could have explored any other number of it. And I realized that I really wanted to take a bold step to just start the conversation. And it was easier and made more sense in terms of starting it from an African American perspective. But I fully expect that as we start these dialogues, we'll be far more equipped and better able to now expand them to the Hispanic community, to the Native Americans, as the question indicates. So you're right, you're absolutely right, and I'm hoping we start having these courageous conversations.
Great. There was a great question here that, Allison, you might want to speak to, which is, we've got a bunch of questions coming in. How do we protect our colleagues who've been wounded from feeling unsafe in these conversations?
Absolutely. There's a saying that says once bitten, twice shy, right? So you start to have a conversation with somebody and you got, snapped at, or you got your feelings hurt, and that causes you, just like we talked about in bias, it causes you then to have the background that says those conversations are not safe, and therefore I will not have them. And I will go back to my recycling conversation, and I will say that if you're drinking a bottle of water and one day you just, you don't see a recycling can somewhere and you just sort of throw it into a regular garbage can, the next time you have a bottle of water, you still will make the effort to recycle. You won't say, well, I'm never recycling ever again. And it's the same with these conversations. If you have had a negative interaction, it's just like anything else. Write that off as a negative interaction. In my book, actually, in the introduction, I have a disclaimer that says not everybody is ready for conversations in the workplace, and there are people with whom you should not engage in these conversations. So if you happen to come across one of those people, let that person stand alone as an isolated incident, and don't let that interaction prevent you from having future conversations.
Great, thanks. Let's see, we have a bunch of questions. We'll get through as many of these as we can. So we only have a few minutes left. So let's see, we have one from, it says, any documented initiatives or programs you're aware of that are successful at decreasing the sense of racism in the work environment? We know a number of organizations now that are working with, for example, we have colleagues at Mount Sinai in New York who are using our unconscious bias work in creating huge breakthroughs in their organization, and we're really encouraged by what we're seeing in the medical school community based on this project that we've been on the last 4 years. So I do think that there are people who are doing these kinds of things, but we have to realize this is not a quick fix, and it's not something that we're going to do overnight. It's something that's going to take some sustained work. Here's another one. In evaluating satisfaction by underrepresented minorities, what's best? Unconscious bias seminars targeting all faculty, staff, or focus groups of majority or underrepresented minority faculty and staff. Our experience is that everybody needs to be involved.
I would just say that there are different forums where everyone can be engaged, and that is the part that does require a bit of thinking through in advance. What is the best forum? What's the best target audience first? What's the best forum, and what's the best format for the conversation? And I think when we use the peanut butter approach that, we do everything the same, I think that's where those conversations are actually not as productive as they could be. It does require a little bit of finesse to figure out the right audience, format, and forum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that there's been a lot of controversy about diversity training and whether diversity training or unconscious bias training has an impact. There are a couple of things about that. One is that we know that research, which was on a slide we showed earlier from Lehigh University Medical School in Arizona State, shows that the training that helps people understand better how they're thinking and making decisions is by far the most effective. And the second aspect of this is that no training program in and of itself is sufficient. We also have to build in other structures and systems that encourage our ability to do this. Just thinking that training will be in and of itself the resolution to this is like thinking signing up for the gym will get you in shape. Another one question, we've only got a few more minutes left, so let's see if we can take one or two more. Any advice for OD practitioners working in environments where we're ready to facilitate the conversations, but leadership is in a different place? Just continue on with our grassroots efforts to embed those important conversations when we can during workshops. I would say, certainly, you do what you can always, and keep doing whatever you can always. But one of the things that's really important is to distinguish from leadership, the entity, this body of people that becomes objectified, versus this leader, and that leader. Yeah. In a lot of cases, people say leadership isn't ready for it, but there may be 2 or 3 leaders in the group who are really open to it. Yeah. And so you start with those individual conversations, and those people, once they're part of the process, can become your ambassadors to get other people engaged and involved. And it's really important that you kind of take that one step at a time. The more people you get into the circle of conversation, the better. Let's take one more quick question. I work for a global corporation. I'm based in the U.S. I'm wondering how to position racial dialogue with people from many countries and cultures, or should the discussions be localized? What we find in our experience is that you can talk generally with people about bias as a phenomenon and then have localized conversations to look at how is it showing up in your world. So we work actually with many global organizations, and as I said at the beginning, we worked in 40 to 50 different countries, and often even within the same company, the way we conduct those workshops. For example, we had somebody yesterday who was in Singapore doing a workshop for one of our companies that's based in New York City, and the workshop was different in content, it was different in style, and it was different in tone, reflecting the culture and the experiences of the people involved. So, good.
It sounds like there are a lot of great questions. We would love to continue this dialogue, open it up for people to reach out to Cook Ross if they have more questions. And thank you so much, Howard. This was so fun.
Oh, yeah,
it
went
really
by very quickly.
I'm really glad we had an opportunity to do this, and we would like to say thank you on behalf of Howard and I, and pass it back over to Juan.
Sure. Allison and Howard, thank you so much for this informal conversation, and we really thank you on behalf of the Association of American Medical Colleges. For our members who would like to continue having this discussion, and others in particular around unconscious bias, health disparities, race in the workplace, please consider coming to the AMC in July. You see in front of you that our next unconscious bias training will take place July 19th in the AMC Learning Center, and in addition to that, we also have the opportunity to do the Unconscious Bias Train the Trainer July 19th through the 22nd, again here at the AAMC. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again for being an active participant of today's Faculty Lifecycle webinar series. With that said, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Juan.
Thank you, Juan.